Hi, it's Jan Howell here with another sewing tutorial. Today I'm going to show you how to make a cozy pair of slipper boots. Of course, from an upcycled sweater. You can make these with any kind of sweater or fleece or a combination of both. I have other slipper tutorials out there and you might want to check those out. But these little gems are the coziest thing ever because they go further up your leg, keeping your calves warm, and they really are quite easy to make. You want to make sure you watch the whole video because, like always, I show you different tips and tricks for using upcycled sweaters. So without any further ado, let's get started. Let's go over the materials and items that you'll need. You'll need the pattern downloaded and printed, and I will put in the description below where you can locate this pattern. Once you print out your pattern, you'll need to decide which size you're making and then cut out the pattern pieces indicated for that size. This pattern size goes up to a men's size 13. Of course, you'll need a sweater that you're going to make the slippers with. You can use a felted wool sweater. This is a wool sweater that I have felted and shrunk down, and I will put in the link description below of some great videos that I have of how to felt them and shrink them down and care for them. So check those out. So this particular sweater is a lot thinner. So when you make this slipper boot up, it's going to be more like a slipper sock and just kind of slouchy and cozy. You'll need a sweater for the sole of the slipper. I like to use a sweater that's a little bit more dense. This is a felted wool gray sweater. It's not real thick, but it is more dense and will be more durable on the sole of your slipper. You don't have to line the bottom of the slipper if you don't want to, but if you want to line the slipper, you can use a piece of fleece or you can use a thinner piece of fabric. You don't want two bulky pieces on the sole or else it will be way too bulky. This is a thin cashmere sweater that will really feel soft and cozy on your feet inside the slipper. You don't line the boot itself, or you can even use polar fleece if you wanted to. You'll need a pair of scissors, some pins, your sewing machine of course, and 4 safety pins. Let's talk just for a minute about the slipper boot cuff. Now the cuff of the slipper, like on this slipper here that I've made, I've used the existing cuff of the bottom of the sweater. If you are using the existing cuff, you want to make sure that it's big enough to go around the calf of your leg. This is probably on the borderline. It doesn't stretch very much, but it does just fit fine on my leg. If you want to add a cuff to it, which I'm going to do on both of these slippers, is to use a cuff of a sweater. You can use the cuff of the existing sweater. This one I'm not going to use, well, I guess I could, but it's just really kind of stretched out. I want something a little bit more stretchy. So I am going to use this nice cozy cashmere, the bottom of a sweater for this, and I will just add that to the top of the boot. So you'll need to find a cuff and you'll need to make sure that it's big enough and stretchy enough to go around your calf. These are cuffs from a red sweater that I've upcycled. Whenever I'm getting my sweaters ready for projects, I usually cut off the bottom 4 inches of the sweater for cuffs, for mittens and for other things. A tip on felting your sweaters, if you're using wool and you have felted it down, to get rid of all that lint and sweater fluff, I don't know what you call it, I like to use this little device that you can use on sweaters when they get start getting bally, and see that? And it just gets rid of that. And this is easier to do before you cut out your pieces, obviously. One thing I need to mention before we go any further, when you're cutting your pieces out of your wool sweaters or any sweater is to check and make sure that there aren't any holes in it. So you can hold it up to the light, and if there's any holes, you'll be able to see it. I like to put a piece of tape, masking tape, on the hole so I don't accidentally cut something out that has a hole in it. And you'll see later in the video what happened because I totally forgot to check that. To cut out the pieces, this is an existing sweater that I've felted down. It's a little bit bulky, but I think it will work out fine. It has a really cute design on it. You want to make sure that your pattern pieces are going to fit. You'll be cutting out 2 of the leg piece, 2 of the outer sole piece. I'm going to use this gray, so I'll cut 2 of that, and I'm going to cut 2 of the cashmere thinner, softer fabric for the lining. And then for the upper piece, you'll cut 2 of those. If you have a stripe or a design, you want to make sure that you have enough fabric to make sure that those are the same. Your leg pieces, well, I'll just show you. To cut out the slipper boot, as you can see on the pattern, it says which way the fabric stretch, which is this. And if you're using a pattern, a stripe, when you fold it in half, you want to make sure that those lines are lining up, and or else it will be crooked. This says to place this edge on the fold. I'm going to place that on the fold and barely have enough that it works out just perfect, and pin it in place. And cut it out. Make sure you're saving your scraps. I have a lot of fun tutorials showing you what fun things you can make with just even the little bits of felted wool sweater fabric. Okay, so to cut out the second one of these, we're going to want to make sure that we are using the same portion of the sweater so that your 2 slippers will match. So I'm folding it in half, lining up the stripes, and let's see the pattern. So if I went like this, it wouldn't be right. So it's like this, see that? And that is where I want to place that so it matches. So I'll flip it over, line it up. There are my leg pieces. I'll set those aside and cut out the top piece. This piece right here and the side. And you'll want to make sure that that is straight. Line up your sweater with the already cut out one. When you cut out the sole piece, you want to make sure you're flipping the pattern so that you're getting a right and a left foot. So you can see that this has a curvature on it for the right foot. If you were to cut out 2 separately, you would get 2 right feet. So that you can either, if you can't fold your fabric in half like this, then cut out one and then just simply flip the pattern and cut out another. So you have 2 right up facing, a left and a right sweater. I hope that makes sense. Or you can, if you have a big piece like this, you can just flip it and fold it in half so that when we're cutting out 2 at a time, but I'm also going to get a right and a left. Again, you want to make sure that the stretch is going the correct way. So I forgot to mention that you don't have to use the right side of the sweater for the right side of your project. Sometimes the wrong side of the sweater has a really nice texture or character. So as you can see, folded over, when I open that up, I have a right and a left. And to mark that and to keep that straight, because it can get confusing, I am going to place a safety pin on the right side of each of these pieces to keep it straight. You don't know how many times before I finally got this that I would sew it up and I have two left sides or something, and it was just so frustrating because it can get really confusing. This will really help. Now let's cut out my lining pieces. Again, I folded it in half so the right sides are facing each other. I'm going to do the same thing with the lining. Right. So we have two lining, two outer sole pieces, two leg pieces, and two top pieces. We're ready to put it together. The first thing we're going to do is take your top pieces and your leg pieces, and we're going to find the halfway points and mark them with a pin. So fold them in half, and just take a pin and place it right on that fold, that center point. And we'll do this with the leg pieces. Now we're going to sew the leg piece to the top piece. Take the leg piece, place it right side facing up. Take a top piece, and we're going to line up those center points. And you can use clips or pins to keep it in place. I really like these clips. And then we're going to, even though this looks like, oh, how am I going to sew this to that? It's quite simple. We're just going to take the ends and clip those. And then see how you can just ease that around those corners. Once you have those clipped in place, we're going to take it to the sewing machine. Everything in this project, we're going to be using a 3/8 inch seam allowance, which is usually just along the edge of your presser foot on your sewing machine. So you can just use the edge of the presser foot to guide you. And we'll be using a straight stitch, and we'll be back stitching at the beginning and the end of the seam. So I have threaded my machine with red thread both on the top and in the bobbin. And my stitch length on this is going to be about 2.5 to 3. So this sweater fabric is pretty bulky. I have put in a little bit more dense universal needle so it won't break as easily. My machine has a walking foot that helps feed this heavy bulky fabric through. If you have a walking foot, I advise you to use it. If you don't have a walking foot, no worries. You can just go slow and ease it with your hands, help it through. Just keep these edges lined up and even. Just flatten those puckers down with your hand. Now, because this particular sweater has all these loose ends, I am going to zigzag the edge so it doesn't fray. So you'll be zigzagging on the portion on the right side of the stitching to secure all these loose ends. I'm going to put my sewing machine on a 5 width zigzag stitch, and the length maybe 1.5. Let's see how that works. I'm going to sew as close to the seam as I can without going over the seam. Now, if you had a serger, you could use a serger as well, but I wouldn't want to use my serger on this bulky of a sweater. If you're using a lighter weight fabric like fleece or knit or this cashmere sweater, the serger works really great. It will give you a nice finished seam without all the bulk. You see those zigzag stitches? Take your scissors and cut away any of the outside of that zigzag stitch, any fabric or strings, or just to create less bulk. But you don't want to cut into the zigzag stitch that you just made. Now, before we sew the leg seam, we need to add the cuff, or if your leg piece already has a cuff on the top, let's say you use this sweater for the leg piece, and the top of this leg piece was the cuff here on the sweater, you wouldn't have to sew this cuff on. You would just sew up the side seam and you're good to go. But since I have to add a cuff onto this, and I'm going to be using this cuff, and it's about the right width, I don't want to undo this seam, but I am going to shorten it up a bit. And I'll do the same for both. There are several different ways you can finish the top of the boot. If it doesn't have a cuff already, you could use the fleece binding like I have a tutorial for, or if you are going to use the existing bottom cuff of a sweater for the top of the boot, lay the cuff on top of the boot without stretching it and cut it the same width. Do that for both sides, and you can have the cuff be as deep, as thick, or as thin as you want it to be. And then take it to the sewing machine and just sew all the way across. Now we're going to sew the leg seam. Fold it in half. Line up that seam that you just sewn and clip it in place, and bring the top edge of the leg piece together. We'll just sew right down there. Start from the bottom of the leg. Usually you would bring the seam allowances both facing the same way, but on something that's really bulky like this, I'm going to flip one seam allowance forward and the bottom seam allowance towards me, but the seam itself will be lined up to create less bulk. I'm going to go back, change my seam to a zigzag stitch, and finish off the seam. Trim away any excess strings, fabric. Okay, now you won't have this issue with a lot of the other fabrics that you'll be using, sweaters, but where this is such a big weave and see how this particular strand is loose? That eventually may pull out. That will come undone. So check to make sure that all your ends, your yarns, are included in the seam. I'm just going to pull that up and sew. And I'll just keep it on the zigzag stitch to include that in. You don't want that pulling out. Like I say, most fabrics you won't have to worry about that, but this particular sweater, how it has such big it's such a big weave and big yarns that it may come undone. If you're using a serger, flip the seam allowance towards the cuff, and when you come to the end, just come to the very end, lift up the presser foot, flip it around, and then just sew a few stitches and then off. Then you won't have those little tails. Now it's time to apply the sole to the slippers. I was getting ready to put my slippers together and noticed a hole in the lining piece. I was so bummed, and this is what I get for not looking for holes in the fabric before I cut the pieces out. Okay, so I ended up not having enough of the gray cashmere, so I found some red cashmere sweater that I have cut out. So take your pieces, take the lining piece, place the right side facing down, and it's lucky we have our safety pins to keep this stuff straight. We're going to bring the wrong side to the wrong side of the lining. Take the top piece. The wrong side is still facing out. We're going to put the right side facing down. Line up the notches at the top of the toe. Pin it in place. Now we're pinning all 3 layers together. Flip it. Come to the heel seam, and that is going to be lined up with the notch on the heel. Come to the notches on the side. Line those up. Now on the heel, you don't want to make this real tight, so I'm going to allow this kind of to puff out and then place it in place. So if I pull it, this back heel area is going to be really tight and constricted. So see how I'm going to pull that out a little bit and then line up all 3 and clip it in place. So give it some leeway because it's going around a corner and that top piece tends to get a little tight. And then just ease all 3 layers, and you'll be adjusting this as you sew as well. Now around this corner here, take all 3 layers and just ease them in. It's clipped and ready to sew. We'll do the other side. Start at one of the side darts and sew all the way around using the same seam allowance and stitch. We're using the straight stitch first. Go slow so you can make sure all 3 layers are lined up and that you're catching these little stray yarns. When you come to this heel seam, just pull it back and lay it flat. You get back to where you started, just back stitch. I forgot to mention that before you do a finished seam, like the zigzag seam, you'll want to check both sides of your project to make sure that you've caught all, because sometimes when you're working with multiple layers, when you might not have caught maybe this lining piece, and then if you zigzag that and finish the seam and find out later that you didn't catch that, that's not real fun to have to unpick the zigzag stitch and the seam. I'm going to change it to a wide zigzag stitch and sew around that while I'm here. Before I turn the boot right side facing out, we're going to apply the cuff. So this cuff is already sewn together, and I'll show you the other method in just a minute. But we want to find the halfway point. There's the seam. Find the halfway point again and mark it with a pin. And then I'll find the halfway point of the boot and mark it with a pin. With the right side facing out of the cuff, line up the seams . Clip it in place. And then line up your halfway points. We'll take it to the sewing machine and sew all the way around, back stitching at the beginning and the end of the seam. And most likely your cuff is going to be a little bit smaller than the boot itself, and you'll just stretch that as you sew. Before I sew this zigzag seam and finish that off, I'm just going to check on both sides to make sure. And this cuff is pretty simple. I'm sure that we're fine and we're good. So now I'm going to go ahead and finish that seam with a zigzag stitch. Trim any bulk, excess fabric off. Now let's turn it right side facing out and see what we have. You can remove your safety pins. Stick your hand in there, spread out your fingers, get those corners pulled out. There you have it. Can't wait to stick your feet in there and see how that feels. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you found that enjoyable and helpful. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Click on the bell so you can be notified when I put new things up. I'd love to know in the comments below if you have any questions or concerns, or if you have any other great ideas of things that you would like me to go over. Stay cozy, stay warm, stay healthy, and have fun sewing. We'll see you next time.